Note here that the 6th century or so is when a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court is set, and around when, legend has it, King Arthur lived. As an example of what you'd be facing trying to talk to someone in the ballpark of this period, consider the Anglo-Saxon chronicles from the late 19th century and the following. And here we go! By 10 Ignand is ether 100 mal lang and 200 mal brad and her sind on pan igvan thief gepodo. I give up. You're looking at it on the screen. Just read it.
Oft skyld tjejen, tjäderna freaten, monigum maig från meru settla often, ägg så det erlands, sythan arest wär, fashion Hedas frover gebai, weox under woknu, weord mundum fa, och that him aig wilch dara umsitindra, over prone
1400, you'd hear Middle English, and you would hardly understand anything, written or spoken.
Juan dat April with his sure sorta, the drocht of March had perset to the road, and barred every lane and switchly core of which vertun gendrat his the floor.
And around the 12th through the 15th centuries, the latter of which is also generally considered to be when the so-called medieval times ended. Noteworthy here is that during the 14th century, while the upper class still spoke Anglo-Norman, as the century progressed, it was almost completely displaced by English. This brings us to the latter half of the 14th century, when Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales. As an example of what English looked like at this point, or at least a poetic form of it, consider these lines from that work. A knight there was, and that was worthy man, that for the time that he first began to ride out, he loved chivalry, truth, and honour, freedom and courtesy. Full worthy was he in his lord's were, and thereto had he ridden, no man fair, as well in Christendom as heatheness, and ever honoured for his worthiness. This
To Shakespeare, we're talking about the sound system, or phonology, that was in use in a period called Early Modern English, and in the period specifically around about the year 1600. Now, it's a period during which pronunciation was changing very, very rapidly. So there isn't just one kind of OP. There's an OP that evolves throughout the period. For example, early on in the period, people were pronouncing the word musician as musician, musician. Later in the period, it had evolved into musician. Three kinds of evidence that you look for when you're working out the pronunciation of a stage in the history of the language. The first and the most important piece of evidence is the observations made by people who were writing on the language at the time. There were several people who actually commented on how words sounded, which words rhymed, and so on. For example, how do we know that the R is pronounced at such a time? Well, Ben Jonson, the dramatist, actually tells us at one point. He says we pronounce the R after a vowel. He actually calls it a doggy sound, grr, or something like that. And so that kind of evidence, where when you look at all the sounds, all the vowels, all the consonants, you put it together, and that's the first kind. The second kind of evidence is the spellings that people use at the time. The spellings were a much better guide to pronunciation then than spelling is today. So at one point in Romeo and Juliet, the word film is spelt Philome, therefore film, and that's a very important indication. But the third kind of evidence, which is absolutely critical from a dramatic point of view, is that there are rhymes and puns which don't work in modern English that do work in OP. One I remember that we did at the Globe here was the pun that suddenly leapt out at us in the prologue to Romeo and Juliet. You do that one?
Right.
Of what is known as the Great Vowel Shift, which occurred primarily from around the mid-14th century through the 16th century or so. In a nutshell, this is where the pronunciation of various vowels in the English language changed considerably. For example, in Middle English, the word bite would have been pronounced beat, and something like the word meat would have been pronounced like mate. This could get really awkward. For example, if a native of the time asked you if you wanted to meet later, and I'm going to leave that one for you to work out. And
today a donor tradition. Which books, learned books are exported most to the European and Western countries? Adi Shankaracharya's commentaries, not Kapil Kapoor's books. Adi Shankaracharya's commentaries. And they are still, you see, the seminal Sanskrit texts, Harvard Oriental series, 193 volumes, translations of Indian classical texts. Max Muller series, 53, 54, I am now, don't remember the exact number. At the end of 19th and late 20th century, the West translated the vast Sanskrit knowledge systems into English and to some other European languages later. And enriched them, because you can't fault them, just not blame them. The entire 19th century Europe took to Sanskrit studies thanks to Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh translated Upanishads into Persian, and one of the translations, it went to Dupont in France. He translated it into French, then it went into Italian, then German, and by 1808, all major universities of Europe had a chair in Sanskrit, and they replaced their understanding of Hebrew as the source language by Sanskrit as the source language, and in fact also wound up several departments of Arabic. In 19th century Europe, every bright young man was doing Sanskrit as our bright young men are doing computer and commerce.
He said, well, this is going to be the grammar, and everyone took him as authoritative. It's like freezing a programming language and saying it's not going to change. And it has positives and negatives, and the positive is that I can take a text of 2 millennia ago. This morning I was reading some of the Charaka Samhita, Ayurvedic text. I can read something from a few hundred years ago, it will be exactly the same. There's no change. You cannot do that in English, absolutely not, or German or French. It's impossible. The geographical span is massive. This would be a 8-hour flight. You know, if you imagine it as a country like, say, Russia. So we have, on the east of Iran, we have historical evidence of Sanskrit, and of course Iranian languages. Modern Iranian Persian is like, it is a Sanskritic language, basically. It's an Indo-European, Indo-Aryan, Iranian language, and very similar. I've read the Avesta, which is the Avestan language literature of the Zoroastrian religion, and that is in the same, it's using the same vocabulary as Vedic Sanskrit, basically. So if you know Vedic Sanskrit, you can unlock the key of Iran. So you wonder why there's conflict when, you know, people just dig a bit deeper and see the commonness that we're sharing. There's no need for the conflict, can very quickly blur in the world. And the eastern span is to Indonesia. You have coins also in the Philippines, so all of these countries have been influenced linguistically through writing, through the philosophy, through the culture, and through the stories, the mythology. And there's a very deep commonness between these regions. And this is where it fits in. Basically, you'll see Sanskrit is here. This is Indo-European. Now, scholars say there was a proto-language. It means a hypothetical reconstructed language before Sanskrit, but there's no records of it that we have linguistically. We know that there was something before Sanskrit, but we don't know exactly what it looked like. And English, which we're speaking here, is in this same family. These are all the branches of Indo-European languages, which is why you'll see so much commonality. Even now when I'm speaking, I can think of Sanskrit roots. You know, virtually everything you're saying, you can link to a Sanskrit sound, and we'll see some of the links today. Here's the countries that speak Indo-European today in the world. As I said, it's almost half of the world. So Indo-European means English, German, most of the European languages except Finnish, Basque language, and Estonian, Hungarian. Just a few. There's a few odd languages that just don't fit in with the picture. They have other roots. So, we were talking about the vastness of the literature. So, So when the British got to India, William Jones was a judge in Bengal, and he had this very famous quote, maybe you're familiar with it. He said, "The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than Greek, more copious than Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing a stronger affinity to both in the roots and the verbs that could not have been produced by chance, by accident." So he started to realize an incredible link between the European languages, like Greek and Latin, and then the Germanic, other Indo-European languages. And here's some examples. If we take this, so we have roots, dhatus in Sanskrit. So vrt is the dhatu here, and pari is the upasarga, the prefix. So parivartate means to turn around. Maybe you all know about parikrama or circumambulation. Okay. So if you look in English, you've got this same root as there: vert, invert, divert, revert, convert, pervert, subvert. So this is what was noticed by linguists, and then they realized that this was the origin of it, basically. And this is, if we take another example, jnana, which is knowledge, and the root here, the dhatu. So that Sanskrit has approximately 2,000 roots that are solidified and crystallized. They're established. They're basically like constants. They don't change. So here's jna, and you'll see the Greek word gnosis, knowledge, know, ignorant, agnostic. So as you learn more and more Sanskrit, your understanding of English becomes much deeper. Take another example, mara. Here's the root mr, which is to die, famous mrityunjaya mantra. You know. Amrit is to not die, you know, to amrit. So here we have mort in Latin, and that very lovely word mortgage, which is till death. And of course, in ancient India, you just got given a house by the king if you were a Sanskrit scholar, so I don't have to think of mortgage. Actually, I was in Melkote with Lakshmi Tatacharya, very great Pandit, and he said, when the king of Mysore was there, if you were a Sanskrit scholar, you had house and maintenance for your lifetime. That was not only Sanskrit, any teacher, you know, it was just a support for scholarly work. Murder, mortician, mortuary, mortify, mortal. So you can see the roots are flowing into our day-to-day language. Here's another one, star, stay, stand, establish, stable, stay. This is a Sanskrit root which means to fix something, like a star bhakti, you know, like the architect. And so one of the things, Sanskrit is an artificial language in the sense that it was engineered by sages or rishis. And one of the things that was done is to fix the phonology, that we have a very scientific way of pronouncing it. So much so that, say you were learning pronunciation, you made one error, you would have to usually go back and start the whole text again. It was incredible discipline. They saw even smallest errors as being quite severe. So they took it's called shiksha. It's basically one of the Vedangas, one of the things that you studied after or before the Vedas, depending on the tradition. And the shiksha solidified exactly how and where you pronounced anything. So this allowed us to preserve the phonology of the language. That means that when we read old Sanskrit literature, we know how it was pronounced. If we read Old Greek or Latin, we aren't sure. We have to reconstruct it. And this is a very important and a beautiful thing. And you can be very proud about this if you're familiar with Sanskrit, because you can know that you're saying it correctly. There's no doubt in your mind. And there are 5 mouth positions, and we'll do a little exercise. So the first sound was up. It's the most natural and the easiest sound you can all make. So if you can just picture in your mouth, this is the back of your throat. This is guttural, basically. And then you have your soft palate, you have your hard palate, your back of your teeth, and your lips. Now if you just take ah, and I want everyone to just move it. So go ah, just move the ah into those 5 positions. So ah, So do you see that on the lips it gets to oo naturally without you thinking what is an oo? This is how the vowels were created in Sanskrit. From R, so R moved to the soft palate and it becomes R. It has to become an E sound. So it's still R, but it's got a different mouth positioning. And all of the sounds in the Sanskrit phonology are in 5 positions, very precisely and very clearly delineated in the literature. This is how you pronounce it. So when it was taught, it was explained anatomically. This is where the sound is resonating. It's aspirated or unaspirated. It's voiced or unvoiced. And maybe we could do a separate seminar one day just on the phonology. This is a huge subject, but I wanted to just highlight that it's been preserved and it hasn't changed since the Vedic language and the classical Sanskrit. If we take English, if we go back to Old English 1,000 years ago, this is pa he pam huse genale hete he gehedre ponesweg a tight word. Modern English, when he got close to the house, he heard a band and a chorus. It's exactly the same. So you can see how you have lost information. This is called lossy compression in computer science. The Sanskrit has lost this because you're having a compressed language, but it is preserved exactly. And this is something very beautiful and very unique about Sanskrit.